Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha and I am here to discuss the vocation, gender and labor during the Victorian age. In the previous lecture, I discussed Jane Eyre, Angel in the House, and the situation of women, gender status, and also the transition that was taking place in Victorian age. So let us see and let us discuss the vocation, gender, and labor, and what does it mean when we discuss all these three, happening during Victorian age. So the 19th century was the time when traditional social boundaries were being eclipsed by rapid development of a market economy and the creation of a class society. Victorian era was believed to be the era of male supremacy in all areas of life. Women had no legal rights. Their husbands or father had rights on women's property in the 19th century. According to dominant ideology, women were created to do household works and look after their children. Their space was limited to the house. They were expected to be the angel of their houses. According to Klein, innocence and inexperience and a cultivated fragility were the characteristics, attributes of the Victorian girls. Therefore, domesticity was the sign of excellence for women. The determined qualities of the angel of the house were extreme emotional sensitivity, unlimited selflessness, weakness of intellect, and a lack of sexual instincts. Women were expected to offer love and moral guidance to her family, and they were also expected to be untroubled by wayward personal desires, including erotic longing. The society even went so far as to affirm the absence of sexual instincts in women. For instance, in the functions and disorder of the reproductive organ in childhood, youth, adult age, and advanced life, considered in their psychological, social, moral relations by William Acton, the anatomy and physiology of the reproductive organs of the woman is omitted. The perfect ideal of an English wife definition offers an idea about the expectation from an ideal English lady. Quote, I believe this lady a perfect ideal of an English wife and mother, kind, considerate, self-sacrificing, and sensible, so pure-hearted as to be utterly ignorant of and averse to any sensual indulgence, but so unselfishly attached to the man she loves as to be willing to give up her own wishes and feelings for his sake. In addition, men used to believe that it was their duty to protect the woman. But the Victorian era also saw a rise in the number of women in the labor force. The Industrial Revolution and the growing middle classes, which needed teachers and governesses, influenced the change. However, not much information is available for the study of the nature of change in the labor force because the census at the time did not take women and their job into consideration. Historians' concern over the recording of women's work in the census have been voiced over a considerable period. In History Workshop Journal in 1986, for example, Sonia Rose argued that many historians have shied away from census data because of some very serious shortcomings in the extent to which women's occupations are reflected in the enumerator's record. Homework and casual employment in general underreported in the census. The following year, in their path breaking work, Family Fortunes, Leonore Davidoff and Catherine Hall insisted, quote, information on women's occupation, where they were not a household head, is so unreliable as to be almost useless. And by definition, married women were not considered heads of households. Similarly, in History, Workshop Journal 35, 1993, in Women, Work and Census, a problem for historians of women, Bridget Hill, while claiming censuses are or should be a way into knowledge of work done by women, asserted that what was common to all censuses was that women's work was consistently under-recorded. In 1995, Sarah Horrell and Jane Humphreys argued in women's labor force participation and the transition to the male breadwinner family 1719 to 1865 that although many authors have used 19th century census data to demonstrate declining female participation and increasing employment segregation, the census enumeration of women's employment is demonstrably inaccurate. Society considered it unfeminine to devote time to intellectual pursuits in case it usurped men's natural intellectual superiority. Some doctors reported that too much study had a damaging effect on the ovaries, turning attractive young women into dried up prunes instead of intellectual study. Therefore, women were coached in accomplishments, painting, music, a smattering of foreign languages, perhaps. It was not until 1870 that girls' education was taken into account by the British authorities. After the Education Act took effect in 1870, elementary education for both sexes became compulsory. Thanks to that act, the girls began to learn reading and writing. Thompson maintains that English families, even upper class parents, did not consider their daughters' secondary education till 1818 and 1890s. Among the working classes, there was little sign of a future for women since they were illiterate. Women were not admitted to universities to take degrees too. University education was open strictly to upper class males. So, university teachers were also male. Women had to be excluded from the universities by a Victorian assumption that women were not capable of sustained, rigorous work required by university studies. The majority of upper and most middle class women did not undertake paid work except for respectable activities like being a governess or a music teacher or even a nurse. Most women of this class were expected just to get married and look after their children and home. Professional jobs like lawyer, vets, civil servants remained close to women through much of the 19th century. Patriarchal society valued the son of the families and supported their higher education in order to preserve the superiority of men in all areas of life. 1848 was a year when the hope for elimination of women opened its way to Victorian women because the state accepted to build a college for the girls who were over the age of 12. Mary Wollstonecraft asserted that lack of education made women frivolous and socially irresponsible, unfit to be comparisons to their husbands, good mothers to their children, or self supporting in the absence of a male provider. In addition to their subordinate status in relation to men of their profession, all women workers shared the experience of being judged by the evolving, contradictory Victorian gender ideal of femininity, which held that women shouldn't work outside the home and that women paid labor was unnatural. Middle class women were not permitted to desire both work and marriage, and thus they were forced to make a choice, which men were not. Also, while not a reason for social ostracism, choosing to remain single was seen as possibly selfish, although it should be noted that marriage was viewed as necessarily subjugating woman's individuality to her husband's will. Men and women were expected to get married. But if a man never married, it wasn't the end of the world. However, if a woman didn't marry, she was looked down upon and pitied. These constructions on gender meant that all aspects of society became gendered, including the world of work. In 1830s, wives often assisted husbands in small businesses, but by the 1890s, work and home were commonly separated. It is calculated that while most men worked, only one-third of all women were in employment at any time. In 1978, two-thirds of women were in employment. These attitudes were to a large extent characteristics of this period. Howard reflected his fellow creatures' view in his article called Work and Leisure about what aspirations they could have in life. What they couldn't, that is, the limitations put by the male dominated society. Let no one accept a post without a settled resolution to believe that their superiors in official position are superiors, or they would not be so placed. The law of subordination runs through the whole course of social life. Why then should women attempt to reverse that law by foolish jealousies, unjust fault findings, or unworthy suspicions? If a girl will not submit in the home life, let her not imagine herself fitted for encountering the various little roughness which must inevitably crop up between subordinates and superiors. In those times, Victorian ideology always imposed the idea that women must have knowledge about art, music, and language to be angels of the houses. Despite all the difficulties Victorian women faced with, they succeeded in working outside their homes, ignoring the harsh criticism of their families and husbands as governesses. Koppelman states that efforts to provide better training for governesses are usually considered the starting point of feminist effort. As a profession, secondary school teaching witnessed some of women's great successes and provided some of the most significant opportunities for advancement, power, and community. Their appearance in public sphere formed inspiration and aspiration for female students to leave private sphere and get active roles in the society. There is a fact that in Victorian times, female teachers had more teaching roles than male ones. However, there was no justice in salary between male teacher and female teachers. Female teachers were humiliated by having been paid lower wages compared to male ones. Lydia Murdoch specifies no matter what the job, women faced a set of common obstacles in the workplace. In 1883, for example, the School Board of London specified that the salaries of female teachers should be three quarters of those for male teachers of equal qualifications and experience. In 1890, male assistant teachers had an average annual salary of £117, while women earned £88 for the same work. The role given to the Victorian female teachers was not teaching the principles of physics, astronomy, or social sciences. As Ellison L. Prentice remarks, they focused on ornamental ideals rather than social science. They aimed to fit their pupils to adorn a drawing room, not to spend time in the kitchen or behind a shop counter. For the purposes of shining in polite society and attracting a husband who could afford to give her a leisured life, a facility in music, dancing, and learning, French were seemingly more functional to a young lady than great skill in computation or an easy familiarity with the nicer points of English grammar. Another major change the Victorian era witnessed was the introduction of female labor in industries. The Industrial Revolution has left a legacy on the world as we know it. It brought many changes, and the view of people and society shifted from family to labor. Before the revolution, when you met someone, it was common to ask who their family was. But now, as a result of the industrial revolution and rise of labor, it became common to ask what they do. Women labor in factories, mills, and manufacturing was new, and the health and societal issues that came with it were also new. There were acts implemented by the Parliament in 1833 and later in the 40s and 50s that did take steps to better these situations. These were the government's attempts and efforts to better labor, mostly for women and children. One of the most disturbing parts of labor in Victorian Britain was child labor. The things children did in factories, mines, mills were terrible and horrific. They were viewed differently than adults. Children could fit in smaller places, so they could do many things adults, especially adult men, couldn't do. Children were often the ones forced to work when their parents went into debt. Most working class women in Victorian England had no choice but to work in order to help support their families. They worked either in factories or in domestic service for richer households or in family businesses. Many women also carried out home-based work such as finishing garments and shoes for factories, laundry, or preparation of snacks to sell in the market or the streets. Women's occupation during the second half of the 19th and early 20th century included work in textile and clothing factories and workshop, as well as in coal and tin mines, working in commerce, and on farms. According to the 1911 census, domestic service was the largest employer of women and girls, with 28% of all employed women in England and Wales engaged in domestic service. Many women were employed in small industries like shirt making, nail making, chain making, and shoe stitching. These were known as sweated industries because the working hours were long and pay was very low. Factories organized work along the lines of gender, with men performing the supervisory roles and work which was categorized as skilled. Throughout most of this period, women were paid less than their male counterparts, working alongside them, which created great financial difficulties for working women. From the 1850s onwards, trade unions began to be established first among better paid workers, and they then expanded to represent a wider range of workers. However, women remained for the most part excluded from trade union. In 1888, Clementina Black, one of the only two women delegates at the Women's Trade Union Council, proposed the first TUC equal pay resolution. This demand was made not on the basis of women's right to equal pay, but on the basis that their lower pay disadvantaged men in the labor market. The resolution stated that where women were employed merely because they were cheaper, all work gradually fell into their hands, and that this resulted in lower wages to the general injury of men and women alike. But it took many decades for this demand to be supported by the wider union movement. Despite the strict stereotypes set in Victorian society, the first signs of feminist political movement began in this era. By the 1850s, this first feminist movement focused on equality in education, work, and having electoral rights like the right to vote. However, Queen Victoria did not support the movement. Despite being a powerful monarch in her own right, she called feminism a wicked folly, suggesting that God created men and women differently, then let them remain each in their own position. In spite prejudices and difficulties, the profession of letters was opened widely to women from 1840s. However, the women interested in writing, such as George Eliot and the Bronte sisters, had to use pseudonyms. Even those who did not use pseudonyms, such as Jane Austen, had to write their novels secretly. One Charlotte Bronte complained about the burden of being a woman writer and expressed her wish to be judged as a writer rather than as a woman with these words, quote, "I wish you did not think me a woman. I wish all reviewers believed Currier Bell to be a man. They would be more just to him. You will, I know, keep measuring me by some standards of what you deem becoming to my sex. Where I am not what you consider graceful, you will condemn me," unquote. Nursing also became a respectable profession for which women had to be trained. The status nursing had before this shift was not at all an honorable one. It was believed that nurses were dirty, often drunken women who took up nursing because they could find no other work. Women also became office clerk and started to dominate the world of retail sales, which witnessed the greatest increase. Gorham states that even though middle class women were underpaid in these widened areas of employment, the opportunities for women in the late Victorian period, in comparison to those of their mothers, were still greater. In the 1860s and 70s, a change could be seen. Women were more than ever able to enter the male dominated world of publishing, even though some women had already been working in publishing before the time. Eventually, they also managed to take on increasingly important and influential roles. Women became author editors. Before this mental shift, which meant that certain women stopped focusing solely on the household and started to become part of the literary world, women often wrote under a male pseudonym because, if identified as women, their work would be seen as inferior to that of a man. By signing a novel, poem, or work in general with a female name, said work was automatically given a certain connotation. It would have been almost immediately categorized under women's writing, meaning not as good as, writing and limiting the topics women were allowed to write about. Not only Emily and Charlotte Bronte used male pen names, writers such as Mary N. Evans, who wrote under the name of George Eliot, decided to do the same in order to receive the acknowledgement they deserved. Victorian literature witnessed a notable subversion of traditional gender roles. As writers, delved into the complexities of gender dynamics and presented unconventional female characters who defied societal expectations. These literary works challenge the prevailing norms of the era, offering alternative narrative and perspectives on femininity and women's role. One significant example of subversion of gender roles in Victorian literature is found in George Eliot's novel Middlemarch. Came out 1871 to 1872. Eliot's protagonist, Dorothea Brooke, defies the prescribed path of a Victorian woman. Instead of conforming to the limited option available to her as a woman of her time, Dorothea yearns for intellectual growth and desires to make a meaningful impact on the world. Through Dorothea's journey, Eliot explores the limitations imposed on women and critiques the societal expectations that confine them to domestic sphere. By presenting Dorothea as a complex and ambitious character, Eliot challenges the traditional gender roles and highlights the potential for women to pursue personal and intellectual fulfillment. Another significant work that challenges gender roles in Victorian literature is Lucia Mary Alcott's Little Women. Alcott presents a group of sisters, the March sisters, who each embody different aspects of femininity and rebellion against gender norms. Zoe March, in particular, defies the expectations placed on women of her time. She rejects marriage as the ultimate goal and instead pursues her passion for writing, a striving for independence and intellectual fulfillment. Through Joe's character, Alcott challenges the notion that marriage and domesticity are the sole aspirations for women, advocating for personal growth and individuality. These examples and others demonstrate that Victorian literature provided a platform for authors to challenge and reimagine traditional gender role. These subversive portrayals of women allowed readers to envision alternative paths and possibilities for female characters beyond the confines of societal expectation. By presenting complex and multifaceted female protagonists, these authors contributed to a re evaluation of women's role and agency in Victorian society. The subversion of gender roles in Victorian literature not only provided literature innovation but also had a broader impact on society. By challenging the restrictive gender norms, these works influenced public discourse and contributed to shifting attitudes toward women's rights and gender equality. They inspired readers to question and critique the prevailing social structures that limited women's opportunities and pushed for a more inclusive and equitable society. The subversion of gender roles in Victorian literature highlights the power of literature as a means of social commentary and transformation. These works challenged the status quo, questioned prevailing gender norms, and opened up new possibility for women's representation and agency. By analyzing the subversion of gender roles in Victorian literature, we gain insights into the changing perception of gender and the ongoing struggle for gender equality. It underscores the significance of literature as a catalyst for societal change and a medium through which authors can challenge and yet reshape cultural norms. With this, I conclude the discussion over vocation, gender, and the labor perspectives discussing during the time of Victorian literature, Victorian era. Thank you very much.